The Australian mining industry is responsible for much of the wealth generated in this country. Over 4,000 companies provide work for over 80,000 workers directly and a great many more indirectly in the towns and communities around our mines. Although fortunately rare, some of Australia's worst workplace accidents have occurred in our mines. And in the Australian community there is a perception that mining is not only inherently unsafe, but that such disasters are inevitable. In the last 3 years there have been 57 deaths in the mining industry, with 2 accidents accounting for 15 of those deaths. Do you remember Moura? Can any of you recall what happened there? When I decided to use the lessons from Moura in my management training courses, I was horrified to find how few people actually recalled Moura, and fewer still recalled those details of what happened there. It's clearly time we shared the lessons from these human tragedies and learned whatever can be learned in a spirit of openness and cooperation. In the United Kingdom, it took the loss of 179 lives on the Piper Alpha to bring about radical and lasting change to the oil and gas industry. From that disaster came some of the most dynamic and far-reaching changes in safety for the offshore oil industry worldwide. Moura has proved to be the catalyst for change in the coal mining industry in Queensland and New South Wales, with lessons for mining right across Australia. So is Moura and the lessons learned relevant to you? I believe it is, because no matter what industry you work in, there will be need for common management skills, many common processes, and your workplace will have very similar legislation in place. What happened at Moura will never be fully known, because those that were there at the scene died, and their bodies lie entombed in the mine, a lasting wound for their families and their friends. The Warden's inquiry has pieced together the events leading to the explosion and the probable causes, together with some recommendations to prevent a recurrence. Their detailed report will probably never be read by many of those who really should read it. There are a great many sensitivities in the analysis of a disaster, not the least of which is a concern that the information may not be used constructively and that there may be criticism of individuals. However, it has become apparent that individual shortcomings arose largely out of deficiencies in training and culture in the industry generally. And if we avoid discussing that disaster, we increase the likelihood of such an event happening again and again and again. Moura No. 2 is on the eastern border of the Bowen Basin in Queensland, 7 kilometres to the east of the town of Moura, 450 kilometres northwest of Brisbane. Coal mining has been carried out at Moura for over 25 years, using both open cut and underground mining methods. The district has seen tragedy on this scale before. On September the 20th, 1975, 13 miners died in an explosion that was found to have been initiated by a spontaneous combustion, and that was at the Kayanga mine located in the Moura district.
13 men were killed at the Kayanga mine at Moura following an explosion in a tunnel.
The mine was sealed and the bodies were not recovered. On July the 16th, 1986, 12 miners died in the Moura No. 4 mine from an explosion thought to have been initiated by either frictional ignition or a flame safety lamp.
A roof fall in the Moura No. 4 pit resulted in a failure of the ventilation system and a build-up of methane and coal dust in the air. It has been determined that a flame safety lamp was then responsible for a violent explosion and that the 12 miners were killed almost instantly.
Moura No. 4 is immediately adjacent to Moura No. 2, and on Sunday the 7th of August 1994 an explosion occurred in the Moura No. 2 mine.
2 shifts, one of 11 men, one of 9, were in the mine working 2 kilometres apart, 260 metres down, when the explosion occurred before midnight last night. The second group used their self-rescue equipment and managed to get out. The remaining 11 miners, 10 of them Moura residents, are still down there 2 kilometres from the mine entrance. Access to the mine from the road has been restricted.
Moura No. 2 had been operating continuously from 1970 and employed around 170 people at the time of the explosion. Safety improvements had more than halved the lost time injury frequency rate in the 4 years prior to the explosion. 512 panel was mined in 2 stages. The first working was to develop the panel by forming solid coal pillars on the advance. Once the headings and crosscuts were developed, the second working was the extraction of all or part of those pillars while retreating from the panel. The first working was 3 metres high, leaving 1.5 metres of bottom coal. This was extracted with the continuous miner operated remotely, making short ramps into the bottom coal. Remote operation was used because there was a danger the 4.5 metre ribs could collapse. The pillars are assisted by ground support techniques that fix mesh and rock bolts to prevent falls of strata or coal. In Moura, the panel was divided into 3 compartments, separated by very large stabilising pillars with 40-metre sides, and inside that were smaller pillars with 20-metre sides. Coal is a carbonaceous material. It contains methane and it releases carbon monoxide when it's broken and exposed to air. And methane is explosive in the presence of air within certain limits, usually between 5 and 15%. Carbon monoxide is hazardous in that when you breathe it in, it's taken up by the red blood cells at a far greater rate than any oxygen that may be present. Therefore, even relatively small concentrations can cause asphyxia and death. The major hazard of underground coal mining is the release of these products in a confined space. Management of these known hazards is by providing good ventilation systems and by carefully monitoring the gas levels, and of course also by precluding any sources of ignition. This is achieved by the use of intrinsically safe equipment and by ventilating to control potential sources of heating. And lastly, by extracting the coal within an expected incubation period for spontaneous combustion, and then they seal the panel to isolate it from the supply of air. The seam being mounted at Moura was 4.5 metres thick, but it contained up to 15 cubic metres per tonne of methane, and it was sufficiently permeable to allow that methane to be drained without any vacuum assistance. Ventilation in the mine actually served 3 purposes. It provided fresh air to those working below ground, it allowed the flushing of gases, including vehicle exhaust fumes, and it provided cooling to the surfaces of the mine workings. Gas monitoring was very effective. It used a bundle-type sampling system with air extracted continuously through small bore plastic tubes to the surface unit. It had infrared analysers that were able to work in both high and low ranges, and they provided a great deal of sensitivity in reading the methane and carbon monoxide levels. Gas concentrations were shown on the computer screen. They were automatically checked against the alarm settings, and then they were stored in the computer. In addition to the main analysis system, they had a system called CAMGAS, Computer Assisted Mine Gas Analysis System. CAMGAS was a standalone system. It was located at the same surface station in the mine as the main system. It required samples collected by hand, and it had a modem link in place to transmit the results to Simtars. Management usually considered the levels of carbon monoxide, oxygen and methane in their day-to-day decision making. But some officials also used other measures, including CO make, which is calculated by combining carbon monoxide readings with the ventilation volume and is considered to be a very useful tool. But all the methods they used were valid and they all provided very useful information. It is apparent that from the middle of June a heating was developing, and that this heating was not detected, or rather not recognised, and that action was not taken until ventilation problems arose in the 512 panel. Coal mining in the panel was almost complete, so sealing was brought forward as a control measure. Sealing was due to start in the week commencing the 8th of August, but it was around noon on Saturday the 6th that it was decided to bring sealing forward. The sealing contractor records being told, "Get your gear over there, it's heating up," and he is supported by the posthumous evidence of the sealing contractor who died in the explosion. Mine officials argued that they saw sealing as a precautionary measure and that they didn't bring sealing forward because of an actual heating. However, the inquiry came to the conclusion that it really was suspected that there was a heating in progress in the 512 panel, and the panel was sealed with some urgency, and with the expectation that doing so would control the heating and prevent a source of ignition developing. The panel was sealed using Techrete seals, which were new to the mine. The seals were made up of a series of wire baskets fixed across the headings into the panel and then filled with a proprietary brand of filling that hardens in time to form an effective seal. On the day shift of the 7th of August, levels of carbon monoxide and methane were steadily increasing. There was a corresponding decrease in the oxygen level in the 512 panel, which was sealed by midday. The bundle system indicated a rise of approximately 6 parts per million per hour of carbon monoxide. As you can see, the levels of methane and carbon monoxide are linear, and the corresponding decrease in oxygen is linear. During the afternoon, the readings indicated a trend that would take the atmosphere in 512 into the explosive range between 2330 and 2400 hours. The panel was behaving much as expected. Being a weekend, there was no handover between the successive deputies on the afternoon and night shifts of Sunday, August the 7th. Just after 11:35 p.m, during a conversation with the 5 South section, the phone cut out, and this was the first indication of the explosion. The men who survived that explosion said they were knocked over by a pressure wave, that they felt their ears popping. In the dust and acrid smoke, they put on their self-rescuers and they made their way to the surface. Visibility was so poor the men had difficulty finding their way out, and their self-rescuers became very hot, indicating the presence of significant amounts of carbon monoxide in the air. It appears likely that the methane gas, which had built up to explosive levels within the panel, was ignited by heating, and the force breached the Techrete seals, at least 2 of which would not have had time to have hardened. Although it seems that this first explosion spread out into the mine with diminishing force after breaching the seals, coal dust doesn't appear to have propagated the explosion. In fact, it played little or no part. There was no refuge chamber or enclosed escapeway for any who may have survived that first blast. The emergency plan was implemented when dust was noticed at the portals of the mine. Power to the twin ventilation fans was lost, but the emergency diesel generator activated one fan, immediately restoring 60 to 70% ventilation capacity. Within 3 hours, power was restored, and with it, full ventilation. Approximately 50,000 cubic metres of methane was being drained from the mine each day. So when explosive forces detached parts of that system, the methane then contaminated the mine atmosphere. These slides show the spread of gases detected after the first explosion, and then when the ventilation was initially restored. Samples were taken from the boreholes, and with these additional holes drilled into the 512 Gopher area, it indicated 3 things. Hydrogen, ethylene and ethane were present. Explosive mixtures of gases remained over a large area of the mine, and greater than 5,000 parts per million of carbon monoxide existed. Fresh air was being drawn into the mine through boreholes by the negative pressure of the mine fans. Because the samples revealed explosive mixtures of gases, rescue teams were not sent in, and personnel were kept away from the mine portals. So what caused this explosion? Well, all panels pass through an explosive range as methane levels rise and oxygen levels fall. The mine officials had an estimate of when there would be sufficient fuel and air to support an explosion. The projection indicated this would occur between 2330 and 2400. What was apparently unexpected was a source of ignition sufficiently close to ignite the accumulated methane. It appears almost certain that the source of ignition was heating that had developed within the panel. The balance of expert opinion believed the heating was deep-seated. It was relatively small and intense based on the transient nature of the signs. If the heating was deep-seated and small, it probably started in early to mid-June, the time when smells were first noted. The inquiry found the following factors contributed to that first explosion. There is no doubt that a heating developed, and one or more of these features might have contributed to it. 512 used a number of short successive ramps to extract the bottom coal. Remember, 3 metres cut, 1.5 metres of bottom coal, short successive ramps cut into the coal. It was actually a very efficient method of mining, but it did tend to leave more broken coal than would normally be found. Ventilation volume was good. They had around 40 cubic metres per second, but a few variations occurred to that ventilation that may have contributed to the development of a heating. The Gulf had those very large open areas, as you could see, up to 25 metres, and even such a substantial volume of air coming in, down the narrow headings, it's fine, but when it spreads out into the large open areas of the Gulf, you get some sluggishness. Localised rockfalls could have occurred in holes in the back row of stoppings. They were designed to act as regulators to help the flow, and it's possible that falls of rock in those areas actually interfered with the ventilation flow. There's also, no doubt, a reduction in airflow through the cross-cuts between the headings. On a number of occasions, the Gulf was deliberately flushed to clear gas accumulations, and the inquiry considered that that was a very bad practice. Deliberate and accidental alterations to panel ventilation may have been alternatively starving and then supplying the Gulf with ventilating air. The incubation period was the time thought to be required between exposing the coal to air and the onset of heating. In this case, it was expected to take around 6 months, and the mine officials believed that if they extracted the coal in the 3 or 4 month program that they intended and then sealed the panel, they could avoid the onset of heating and the risk of spontaneous combustion. By relying on this incubation period, they probably gave themselves a false sense of security and made them less alert to the other indicators that might have identified the heating. There was also an inadequate assessment of risk. In fact, in a risk assessment that they carried out after mining started on the 512 panel, they identified only one risk related to spontaneous combustion, and they gave it a low probability, whereas they found 44 risks associated with machinery. Unfortunately, they also took no additional precautions to prevent spontaneous combustion, although they were using different mining methods. So there was a lot of information around on spontaneous combustion, and a significant amount was known by various people at the mine. But no one appears to have been aware of all the factors leading to the development and the identification of heating. The inquiry found also that knowledge wasn't always applied. For example, although nearly everyone recognised the importance of sensory indicators such as smell with spontaneous combustion, they didn't always apply that knowledge, and they found ways to explain it away. Empty oil cans in the Gulf, smells from resin, bulk resin, etc. And even the shimmer and the haze, they found ways to explain it away. All of the mine officials would have had training in spontaneous combustion, but it appears that they didn't update their knowledge with current literature on the subject. A lot of the mine officials, the mine rescue superintendents and even the check inspectors attended a seminar following the Moura 1986 disaster, and that introduced some of the most comprehensive and coincidentally still current today information. In fact, CO make was one of the factors introduced at that conference. But when they returned to the mine site, that information wasn't shared with the rest of the workforce. In fact, none of the other information from the conference was really spread around either. And even the Mines Rescue Brigade, who tended to provide a lot of the training information for the mine, they intended to put it together in a package for the workforce, but they didn't get around to it either. The inquiry found that as a result, the mine officials had an ongoing and mistaken belief that a steady rise in carbon monoxide could not indicate a problem, and an exponential rise was required to indicate a heating. They had a steady rise, and they were looking for an exponential rise if anything was going wrong. There is also a phenomenon that occurs underground when warmer air rises. The cooler air of the ventilation flow remains below, and this forms layers, and the layers don't mix. The gases produced by the heating would have risen into the upper layer and avoided detection by the gas monitoring system. It's most likely that there was layering in the atmosphere in the Gulf, with higher levels of carbon monoxide and methane at ceiling height, but there were no sampling points at that height. There was also an understanding that persistent tarry or benzene smells were evidence of heating, but it wasn't recognised that wafting or fleeting smells could be important. From June the 17th, there were a number of reports of smells from the 512 panel, all of which proved to be fleeting, and they were reasoned away, as I said, as roof bolt resin, empty oil cans, etc. And they completely missed the importance of those signs. And there was no follow-up to those reports, not by anyone, not even the person who actually submitted the report. SIMTARs have indicated that it can be extremely difficult to pinpoint the source of gases to locate a heating, because most heatings develop deep in the broken coal, where the airflows are very low. They advise that when investigating fleeting smells, there may be no other signs, and it is necessary to continue to re-examine that area until you get detectable concentrations of carbon monoxide on a continuous basis. You can then trace them and find the source of the heating. There were no further reports of smells from the 24th of June until the 5th of August, but ventilation problems were being experienced, including the layering, and on one occasion air was migrating back out of the number 2 heading, normally an intake route. Failure to apply that knowledge. Well, in late July, carbon monoxide readings were higher in the top return than the mine's tube bundle system, but the high reading was considered to be an anomaly when subsequent levels of around 5 parts per million were obtained, because no one taking the readings knew about the ventilation difficulties or about the smell observations back in June. One of the mine officials initiated some daily Draeger readings. He wanted to compare them with the readings from the tube bundle system. This positive initiative somehow broadened out to include methane, oxygen, wet and dry bulb temperature readings, and it went from being a daily task to once each shift. When the official went on leave who initiated the monitoring, they just ceased. And if anyone had been examining the data or had continued to do the monitoring, it may have caused concern a lot earlier. Because from a base of around 14 litres per minute in July of CO make, results for the following 2 weeks produced a lot of readings up around 17, 18, 19, and in fact on the day and night shift of August the 6th, 18.94 and 21.04 were the CO make readings. 10 litres per minute is considered to be worth watching, 20 litres per minute is cause for grave concern. No one appears to have demonstrated any concern. Overall, the way the monitoring was started and then simply stopped without arousing either curiosity or even interest is quite concerning. During the day on August the 7th, preparations were undertaken to seal the panel. They brought in overtime workers and they relocated the sealing contractor. The employees were advised of the haze and possibly the tarry smell, but apparently not the carbon monoxide readings or that recirculation factor. The sealing contractor told the inquiry that while he was sealing, he smelt a smell that he'd never smelt before underground. Gas readings continued, but top readings were hampered by the sealing activities and the readings showed nothing to cause alarm. No one appears to have revisited the number 10 crosscut area, although there'd been a report of a smell there 3 days earlier. And while access was available to the panel, there was no comprehensive inspection of it prior to final sealing. Three questions were facing management that Sunday night. Should the men go underground? What do we tell them? And what if they raise concerns? Several unsatisfactory discussions took place between mine officials regarding personnel being in the mine as the panel passed through the explosive range, but there was no clear resolution or instruction. There was a view that no one should be forced to go down the mine. No one reviewed the practice of working while the sealed areas passed through the explosive levels, although there are a lot of things about 512 panel that indicated it could be different. The inquiry found that management didn't assess the understanding of the workers about the situation, that they failed to make them fully aware of all the facts for what was to become for them a life or death decision. They didn't actually make them aware that it was their decision to make, and the inquiry considered it extremely unlikely that those workers would have known all the facts or would have understood the situation. Communication systems at the mine were also unsatisfactory, and they were affected a lot by the staffing arrangements. Many of the events that were of significance occurred on a Friday. There was a ventilation difficulty on June the 17th. There was a first report of a smell on the 24th of June. And after Friday, of course, was the weekend when officials didn't have a formal face-to-face handover. The result was that follow-up on issues that really did require action often failed to take place. And of course, the explosion occurred on a Sunday. Even the formal reports in the mine were fairly flawed. The under-managers tended to focus on logistics issues, and safety information was left to the deputies' reports, or the grapevine. The deputy reports were often fairly perfunctory, and in many cases read and not acted upon, or not read at all. Managers relied on being kept informed, but they didn't have in place an effective communication process, and verbal reporting to them was quite common. This meant that no one person was privy to all the facts available in order to make informed and appropriate decisions. Evidence from after the first explosion and analysis of samples from the boreholes and additional holes that were drilled indicated that methane fueled that explosion. One borehole also produced coal dust, which may have been an additional source of fuel, although that's thought unlikely. It was more likely to have been generated by the explosion. The second explosion was observed by many on the site and was more severe than the first explosion.
30 hours after the explosion, which cut contact with the 11 men who'd been sent to work 260 metres below the surface, everything appeared quiet. But away from the mine entrance, rescue and recovery preparations were well underway. Holes were being sunk to monitor gas levels, state-of-the-art equipment was being flown in to analyse the risks, and a robot called a Numbat was being readied to go into the mine. But given the risks, there was no possibility of anyone entering the mine today. Talk was turning from that of rescue to that of recovery. Then, even as police and mine officials prepared to brief the media, that too was dashed. A second explosion, so huge that a cloud of smoke and dust blackened the sky over Moura and wiped out all and any hope that had existed. Then shortly afterwards, yet another blast. And then thick, acrid smoke billowed from the entrance and every shaft leading into the mine. On the ground, emergency workers retreated from their forward control post, aware more explosions could follow.
Evidence showed that the second explosion may have involved coal dust propagation. This test footage of the simulated coal mine explosion demonstrates that as the gas ignites, the explosion generates coal dust, which then propagates the explosion.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
During the second explosion, the ducting linking the mine fan to the shaft was destroyed, and large volumes of dust, smoke and toxic gases erupted from each of the entry portals to the mine. Carbon monoxide levels rose to around 400 parts per million in the administration areas, 250 metres from the mine, and self-rescuers were needed. Mine ventilation reversed, with the upcast shaft becoming the fresh air intake of the mine, leading to the assumption that active fires were burning underground and drawing in air. The incident team was unanimous that if it were possible, an attempt should be made to remove the bodies of the miners and to try and gather evidence to find out what caused the explosion. But following that second explosion, the team was again unanimous that the mine should be sealed.
Regrettably, the circumstances of the second explosion and the resulting damage that will have taken place in the mine means that there is no hope of recovering the bodies of the 11 men still in the mine.
The decision was made to seal all entrances, including the shaft, to starve the fire of oxygen. Consideration was given to locating an airlock or a safe haven in the transport tunnel prior to sealing, but neither was available. The time and cause of death of those who perished remains unknown. What caused the second explosion? Despite not knowing the answers to these questions, the inquiry was able to make a number of recommendations and comments. The recommendations were focused on a need for change in the coal mining industry and addressed deficiencies in the legislation, mine management systems in general, and to a lesser extent in Moura specifically. It is recommended that all mines be required to develop and implement a robust spontaneous combustion management plan that is based on risk assessments at each mine. Moura and all other mines must put in place mine safety management plans that are also based on risk assessments. Training should be a responsibility of the employer and should cover all employees, with improved training for all post holders and with spontaneous combustion specifically addressed in the training. The inquiry also recommended a review of procedures for granting statutory certificates, notably that they be granted for set periods and revalidated by formal reassessment, that a statutory position of ventilation officer be established at each underground mine, that an industry working party be set up to develop guidelines for the industry covering life support for escape. An industry working party be set up to examine and report on a range of issues related to emergency escape facilities and refuge chambers. The recommendations relating to gas monitoring alarms were directed at making the alarms distinguishable and that mines have a response protocol that is actually followed. The legislation covering seals and monitoring of sealed areas is to be reviewed and upgraded. The Chief Inspector of Coal Mines is to convene an appropriate industry working party to develop guidelines and that mines develop a protocol for the withdrawal of personnel when conditions warrant. A full listing of recommendations and comments is available in the report. So, how do we apply this knowledge to your workplace? Although the inquiry was an investigation into the outcomes of a spontaneous combustion in a coal mine, the lessons learned have relevance for all workplaces, especially the need for us to have strong and visible management commitment to the safe operation of each workplace, that every workplace should have in place effective safety management plans that are based on actual risks present in that workplace, that all workers should have access and follow clear and well understood procedures, and that management applies a systems approach with feedback and correction loops to all of their management safety systems, that every workplace has a system of clear and effective communication that is followed, that each employee and the supervisory staff all have training, especially in maintaining skills and knowledge, and that they take into account new information as it becomes available, that all employees have responsibility for hazard recognition, and that those hazards are subject to assessment and control mechanisms. It is also critical that each workplace has a process for the analysis of change. Changes in conditions, changes in equipment, changes in personnel and processes. That there are trained operators familiar with and utilising any specialist equipment if it's available, and that each workplace should have effective emergency response arrangements appropriate to the level of emergency that could occur in that workplace. Mining, like so many other work activities, is associated with significant hazards. It is the responsibility of management to identify those hazards, to manage them, and control the risk to those men and women who work for them.